In a previous video, we took a look at some paint effects by going to Generate, Get Brush, and selecting, for example, some of these trees here. In particular, we took a look at the bamboo tree, which then we could paint into our environment like this. In this video, we'll look at how to create our own trees or other plants entirely from scratch. So I've started a new scene here, and I'm going to go to Generate and select the Paint Effects tool. And if I draw in my scene, I get this very generic standard paint effects brush. Now, with my brush selected, with my, you can see I have the stroke default brush 1 selected here. I will go to my attribute editor on the right, and we have a number of tabs here. I'm going to switch over to this default brush tab here. And we'll start working with some of the settings here in the attribute editor to create our plant. So the first place I'm going to go to is going to be here under tubes. I'll expand tubes, and then I need to check this tubes checkbox. And when I do that, I get this. It converts my my brush stroke into this what looks like a curve here, along with these stems, for lack of a better word, that come out of the stroke. So under the tubes, you'll find that there's this section called Creation, and that's the section that we'll initially start working with to create our plant, our unique new plant that we create from scratch. Let's take a look at some of the different settings. I recommend playing around with these tools first without trying to actually make anything deliberate, just experimenting with them and seeing what all these different properties affect. So for instance, if we look at the tubes per step, you'll notice that the greater I make it, the more tubes per step we get on our brush stroke here. It becomes very dense. Initially, when designing your tree or flower or whatever plant you want to design for this assignment, I recommend bringing the tubes per step down quite low. That way you can concentrate on looking at just a few of these as you design your plant. Some other properties are tube rand, which has to do with a randomization of the distribution of these plants along this curve. And then the start tubes, which if we increase that, it merely increases the number of these tubes at the beginning of the stroke here. So in this situation, it's not particularly useful. The segments is set to 10 right now, and if we zoom in and press 4 on a keyboard, you'll see this is not polygon geometry, but you can see how it's broken up into segments. And if we increase that, we get more resolution, and if we decrease it, we get less resolution. For now, I'm going to bring it to 12, but we may end up increasing this number later on when we start adding some other techniques for further shaping this plant. Length min and max found here have to do with the length of these tubes. If I increase the length max, for example, their height becomes greater. If I bring the length max back down, their height becomes shorter. Length min is set to 0 right now, meaning that the minimum that they can be could be nothing, more or less. So if I increase the length min, for instance, let's take a look at this. We'll make both the length min and max very close in number. So we'll make perhaps the length min 3, and we'll make the length max 3.1, let's say. And you'll see that they're all roughly the same length. So this is a perfect way to get a little bit more variation in the plant that you create. For instance, if you think about being in the forest and you may see a grove of oak trees, they may not all be the same height. Some are younger, some are older, some get more sunlight and therefore are taller, others are in the shade and they don't grow as fast and are shorter. We can simulate that by having a variation, a greater variation between this length min and max. So I'm going to bring my length min back down a little bit to get a little bit more variation in height here. The tube width 1 and 2 have to do with the width, or let's say the circumference of these. You can imagine if these were trees, then these would be quite tall, skinny trees. But if we wanted to make them thicker, let's say at their base, we could increase the tube width 1, like this. And as you can see, that increases their width. Perhaps we want this even wider than what appears to be the maximum when we scrub in here. And we can do that. We can set that to a larger number. This is probably too big, so I'll just scale it down some. The tube width 2 has to do with how it tapers. And as you can see, these taper and become very pointed at the ends. If we were to increase that, then they'll become thicker. In fact, if we were to increase them and make them the same or bigger even than the tube width 1, let's say 0.6, then you'll see that they'll in fact be even wider at the tops than they are at the base. I'll bring that back down to something a little more like this. Now that I've made these plants or these trees thicker, they're starting to feel a little bit crowded. So I'm going to return back to my tubes per step and bring that number down even further. I think again that this is particularly useful to be able to reduce the number along this stroke because it'll make it easier to design this tree. We're going to return here in just a moment, but I want to point out one more thing. I don't really like how these two trees are bunched up together and these three are bunched up together. I'd rather have them distributed a little bit differently. And I can do that by going to this tab here and working with the seed, which has to do with the randomization of the distribution of these trees along this stroke. There's no magic number here. If I just scrub through here, I can find perhaps an arrangement I like better and work with that. Perhaps this is a little bit better. Maybe we'll go with this. They're a little bit more better distributed. These are kind of close together. We could try something else. actually, this can work quite well, so we'll go with this. I'm going to return to the other tab again. In this case, it's called Default Brush 1. Okay, so we've looked at the length min and max and the width 1 and 2. We also have some randomization with the width as well as a bias, and you can explore those parameters and see what they do. You can see this is adding a certain randomization to it, while the width bias, on the other hand, generally, let's see, the width bias doesn't appear to be doing anything right now. So we'll take a look at some of these other parameters. The segment length bias, you can see what that's doing here. Adjusting as far as its width and making it favor one side to the other is what that's doing. Either favoring the top or favoring the bottom. This could be very useful for shaping your tree. And you can see also what the segment width bias is doing. So now that we have, let's say, the trunk of our tree, I'm going to go to the next section under tubes. We might go back to creation. Well, we're still in creation actually, but we're going to go down to width scale here. And there are a couple different properties we're going to look at here. First of all, you'll notice that these trees are not very upright, and we can work with that with these properties here. So I'm not going to start with the elevation min and max yet because it'll be a little bit easier to see what these two properties are doing if we explore them first. Notice that if I scrub this, it changes its orientation, as does this value here. But the elevation min and max, if I bring those up, we can make these trees much more upright. We can still deal with these. You can just see that they rotate a little bit less then. It's a little bit less apparent when I adjust those values then. So maybe we don't want them entirely upright. Oftentimes when you go in the forest, trees will oftentimes have a bit of a lean to them. So we'll go ahead and keep a little bit of a lean with these as well. So earlier we took a look at some of these properties here that had to do with the width of the trunk of our tree. We have further control here with this ramp that we have here. Let's expand that and take a look and see what's happening. What you can see is that over its length, I can make it taper even more, as this suggests here. I can also add more points in here if I want and make it vary over the length of it. That could maybe make for an interesting tree. This may also require, however, that we increase our segments if we wanted to get a little bit more resolution in it. You can see that this could be where having perhaps a little bit more segments along the length could be useful. Now I'm going to get rid of these, but keep them in mind if you want to have further control for shaping your tree. One other property we'll take a look at before moving on is this one here, the tube direction, which is set to along normal, which also is one of the reasons why they are now upright. However, this drop down, if we were to change that to along path, that would change the orientation of these plants here. So they're no longer going according to the normal, but rather along the path. I'm going to switch it back to along normal. We'll now move on to growth, found here. And if I expand on that, you'll see that we have a number of different things that we can add to our tree. Branches, twigs, leaves, flowers, and buds. We will start with branches, and by enabling branches, before we do that, let me just expand on branches here. You'll notice that this is grayed out, and that is because we don't have any branches. But as soon as I select branches, this will become enabled, and then we can start dealing with its properties. Now, if we start looking at these properties and begin here with the start branches, you'll notice that if I increase that, we'll start to get something that becomes a little bit more maybe bush-like rather than tree-like. I'm going to scale that back. Number of branches is pretty self-explanatory. You can see that it's set to 2 right now, and this is branching off into 2 and 2 and so on. If we were to increase that to 3, then we have 3 branches. Each of those 3 branches is also branching off into 3, and so on. We can go to 4, or whatever other number we want. I'm going to keep it at 3. If we look at the split max depth, you'll see what that does. And if I increase it, you'll notice that we get a much fuller tree with more branching. And if I bring it back down, we get less branching. You'll also notice it's affecting where along the length of our tree that the branching begins. Perhaps I'll go with something like this. Now, right now, all our branches are branching off as 3 and 3 and 3 and so on. And perhaps that's not entirely realistic. Oftentimes there'll be a little bit of randomization if you look at actual trees, and we can do that with the split rand here, or sorry, with the branch drop off here. So if we bring the branch drop off down a little, you'll notice that we get a little bit more variation here, where many of them may branch off to 3, but there's some that may only branch off to 2, and so on. There's a variation in there that maybe adds a sense of realism to our tree. We can also look at some of these other properties. There's the split rand, adding further variation. The split angle, this is a very useful one for helping define the shape of your tree. You'll notice that if I make the number smaller, we get something a little more upright like this. And if I bring the number larger, we get something more like this. I think I'll go with something perhaps like this. Again, play around with these different properties. Split twist is pretty self-explanatory. You'll see it. You can adjust the twist of your tree using that property. Split size decay. You can see what that does. The split bias, which also affects where along the length. Some trees, for instance, the branches has a very long trunk, and maybe the branches start very high up on the tree. Other trees, the branches start very low, and you can use this property to create that look for your trees. And then the minimum size doesn't appear to do anything in this case. But then the middle branch, that's a good one to be familiar with. And what you'll see if I turn on the middle branch is that where it branches off here, for instance, we get this middle branch here that also comes out further, allowing you to get a different look to your tree. I'm going to turn that off because I like how this keeps maybe the tree a little bit more airy. Now, besides branches, we also have twigs. Again, you'll notice that none of the twig properties are enabled right now, and that's because we don't have any twigs on our tree. But if I come back up here to growth and I turn on twigs, then we will also get twigs on our tree. And if I come once again to its properties, we can change it as well to further fine-tune our tree. We have our twigs in cluster here. If you need thicker clusters of twigs, number of twig clusters, you can see how that adds these clusters of twigs also in here. Twig drop off to get a little bit more of a randomization happening there. The twig length, this is pretty self-explanatory. You can set the length of the twigs on your tree. The twig base width, which affects the the base here and making it thicker. And the twig tip width, which you can also make thicker or thinner depending on the needs of your tree. Twig start, where you can make them happen further down on the tree or occur further up on your tree. Twig angle, twig angle 2, twig twist, and twig stiffness, which in this case also appears to not be doing much, but may have more of an effect when we apply gravity to the tree or wind, that kind of thing. So in addition to twigs, we of course have our leaves, flowers, and buds. But before we start looking at the leaves and flowers and buds, I'd like to actually explore some other properties that we'll be able to see a little bit better before we fill this tree with leaves. So to do that, I'm going to come down here to behavior. We'll expand on that, and you see that there are actually different types of behavior having to do with forces, turbulence, spiral, bend, and so on. We'll take a look at displacement first and play around with some of its parameters here. Displacement delay doesn't appear to do much. Noise, however, will actually add some nice bend and shape to these trees. This is again where we really do need to make sure that we have enough segments on our tree. If we don't have enough segments, then there's not much to bend. So we want to make sure that we have enough segments here, but also not too many. Noise frequency will affect that noise. Think of it as a wave, and think of it as wave lengths, and if you increase them or decrease them, you'll get more bends within your tree. A noise offset, wiggle. Most of these properties are going to be fairly similar to one another. We've got wiggle, as well as a wiggle frequency, and a wiggle offset. Curl, along with a frequency and an offset. So a couple more properties that we can look at to change the look of our tree is found here in forces. And notice my path, this kind of S-shaped path that I drew earlier. And if I scrub here in the path follow, you'll notice that these plants now tend to follow along with the path that I drew. And the path attract will draw the tree down towards the path. A couple other properties we can look at is the random. But the one I'd really like to draw your attention to is gravity. This is a great way to get it to feel a little bit more heavy, like it's actually being weighted down. Notice that when I bring gravity all the way up to maximum, it actually starts to go straight down. However, if I check on deflection, it is as if it collides with this ground plane here. I'm going to give it just a little bit of gravity. For the time being, we'll skip turbulence. We'll go back to turbulence in just a moment. But let's take a look at spiral and bend. You can see what spiral does. It twists the tree around. That can be interesting. And you have some parameters such as spiral max and spiral decay to further fine-tune that. And we also have bend. Along with a bend bias. Now, returning to turbulence here, this one is interesting because if we turn it on, turbulence type here, and let's say we turn it onto tree wind, you'll notice that it changed. And we can adjust things such as the turbulence and the frequency here, and that will also change the look of our tree. However, if I play it in my timeline here, nothing is happening. Now, if I come over here to generate and I say get brush, and I pick one of these other trees, and in particular one of these ones that is affected by wind. So I'm going to pick this one here as an example, birch blowing. I select that and I draw one of those in here, and then I hit play. You'll notice that now not only is this birch tree moving in the wind, but so are the trees that I created. I'm going to bring down the turbulence on my trees because I think that was a bit much. Let's try a much reduced number of maybe 0.05, and perhaps that looks a little bit better. I don't know why I need to drop this birch tree in here. There's something about the birch tree that it's bringing in that is then kicking in the turbulence on these trees. And if any of you are able to discover what that thing is, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and delete this birch tree that blows in the wind. These will still work now. And let's see if we go back to its settings. we'll take a look at a couple other things that we can do to customize this tree. Now that we've, let's say, worked on the shape of the general tree here, I think we can go back and look at the leaves. So I'm going to enable leaves, and now we have some leaves on our tree. Now that we have leaves on our tree, we can go over to the leaves here, and we can adjust its properties to adjust the way that the leaves are on our trees. So let's see what we can find here. Leaves in cluster has to do with the number of leaves in any one of these clusters, and we can create more density by increasing that number. I think for the time being I'll leave it at 1 so that we can more easily see the individual leaves. We also have number leaf clusters here, and you can see how increasing that has distributed the leaves a little bit more nicely along the length of these branches here. Leaf drop-off is going to give it a little bit more randomness as far as maybe some areas being a little bit sparser than others. Leaf length is pretty self-explanatory. If we zoom in and look at an individual leaf here, you'll see that that'll make the leaf longer or shorter. And also leaf base width and tip width are also pretty self-explanatory. We can make it thinner at the base, thicker at the base if we want. We can do the same for the tip as well. I'm going to make them somewhat rectangular like this because we'll also take a look at this leaf width scale. And once again, we have a ramp here that we can also further use to shape our leaves. And some additional properties that we have with the leaves can be found here with the leaf start. Notice that we can make the leaves start further down the tree or bring them up more into the tops of the trees. We can adjust leaf angle. We've got, in fact, 2 properties, leaf angle 1 and leaf angle 2. I recommend playing around with those. I'm not sure exactly how they work, but by adjusting them, you can certainly change the way that the leaves are oriented on your tree. Leaf twist. Make it look a little less regular. And leaf bend. To add a little bend to the leaves. As well as this leaf curl section, leaf face sun. Again, some of these I'm not exactly sure how they work, but they are worth playing around with and exploring to see how you can better fine-tune your tree. Here's one that's pretty self-explanatory, however, the leaf segments. The more leaf segments you have, the more resolution you have on your leaf, the less, the simpler the leaf looks. Leaf flatness. If you want the leaf to be less flat, you can see this actually gives it some volume where it's flat, and here it actually becomes almost more pod-like. As well as a number of other properties like the leaf size decay, which as you can see, the leaves become bigger as we get higher up on the tree. Leaf stiffness. And then very importantly, the leaf color, which is found here. Currently it is using two different colors. And to get a better idea of how this is working, let's go ahead and change them to something very drastic like red. And perhaps we could try this green, and you could see what's happening there along the length of it. If we wanted to do something a little bit more realistic, maybe we'll go with a dark green at the base, and then maybe a lighter green but desaturate it some. Maybe something like that. And in addition, we can add some randomization to these colors. Leaf hue will randomize the actual hue of it. So if we are subtle with it, we can get some, we should be able to get some variations in the color. Oh, here we go. I can see some variation happening. If I really scrub it over there quite a bit, we get a little variation. Probably get more variation if we were to actually change the other color. Maybe not though. Make that a little darker. We can randomize the saturation of it as well as the value. And before wrapping up this video, we'll take a look at one more thing, and that is how we can change the color of the actual tree itself. And to do that, I'm going to come way up here to shading and tube shading. And what you'll notice is that we have two colors, color 1 and color 2. And in fact, you can see along the length of the tree, it's using color 1 at the base, and then it gradually moves towards color 2, which is this white. So if we were to take color 1, and once again we'll try something unrealistic like this red, and color 2, and we were to do something like that green, you'll see how the two colors blend. If we wish to do something a little bit more natural looking, perhaps we can come in here and change this to a brownish gray, perhaps, make it fairly dark, desaturate it somewhat, and maybe do the same for color 2. I'll pick the very same color, but maybe I will lighten it up a little bit, maybe even do a little bit of a color shift to it. Let's make the first color a little darker as well. And here is my tree. Now that I have designed my tree, if I select it and go to Generate and say Get Settings from Selected Stroke, I can create more trees using this preset now by simply painting them in to my scene like that. We can also create a simple environment if we wish. In this case, I'll create a plane. Perhaps I'll move it up here just to get it a little out of the way here. And I'm going to add some divisions to it. I think I'll scale it up a little bit bigger. Maybe I'll bring it down here actually so we can see the trees that we have here still. And what I'm going to do is come in here, turn on my self-selection tool, And we'll just create a very simple environment. Nothing complicated. And what I can do is select the geometry here, go to Generate, and say Make Paintable. Now, with my brush, I can paint my tree on this environment. I'm going to get rid of these here. And as you can see, I'm now creating a very simple environment and populating it with my trees. And notice, actually, that if I select one of these strokes here, and I go back to its properties, and increase the gravity on them, as well as turn on Surface Collide, they will collide with this surface as gravity affects it and pulls it down to, to my landscape, to my ground that I've created. I'll bring the gravity up a little bit more again. So in a nutshell, that's how you can create trees. The next video I believe that I'll be making will look at some further ways that you can customize these leaves on the tree, as well as some ways that maybe we can do a little bit more using texture on the trees themselves. I hope that this video has been interesting for you, and thank you for watching.